Hi everyone, this will be my first ever guide for Final Fantasy, and I'm going to be doing a summoner guide. I've had several people ask me to do a guide to more or less introduce people to the job. It's not quite as intuitive as the other two caster jobs in Red Mage and Black Mage, where Black Mage you kind of pick it up and you go through your fire and ice phases, and Red Mage you build your black and white mana and then do your melee combo, where summoner some parts are intuitive and other parts may not be, at least not to everyone. So the purpose of this guide will be to introduce people to the summoner job, its basic rotation, and to go over things a lot of players get wrong, especially with the Bahamut and dot rotation. Well, the first thing I want to go over is probably the first question a new summoner would have, and that is, which pet should I use? Now, at the beginning of Stormblood, everyone was using Garuda, and then around 4.1, people are switching to Siegfried, or rather Ifrit on Sick instead of Obey. And then they nerfed Radiant Shield, which is an Ifrit ability, and everyone has since pretty much unanimously decided that Garuda is the best to use, and that is the one that I use, and that is the one that I'm going to teach you to use. Now, Titan is pretty much useless. You can use him in solo content, I guess, to kind of be your own tank. I don't really need him as that. If you kill a thing fast enough, you don't need a personal tank. And Ifrit, you can use him pre-pull for Radiant Shield to buff the physical damage dealers in your party. You can also use him during downtimes in fights to use Radiant Shield. He's also pretty good for like trash pulls and dungeons like that. That's where Radiant Shield actually outweighs Contagion, because the Radiant Shield will proc and hit all of the enemies rather than just Contagion where it's only on one. And you can actually also use Titan pre-pull for a Ruin 4 proc, and I'll explain the Ruin 4 proc on the next slide. Now I want to go over first the 5 GCDs you're going to be using for rating purposes. Your two spells, or 2 GCDs that you're going to be using most of the time, are Ruin 2 and Ruin 3. The only difference is Ruin 3 is a hard cast at 120 potency, and Ruin 2 is an instant cast at 100 potency. Obviously, you want to use more Ruin 3s than you do Ruin 2s. But your job as a summoner is, and any caster for that matter, is to do your ABCs, as in always be casting. So your GCDs should always be spinning. There is no excuse to not have them be spinning. So if you're doing a Ruin 3 and you need to move soon, finish your cast, hit Ruin 2, it's instant, so you have 2.5 seconds to move to where you need to be, and then continue casting your Ruin 3s. If you have farther to go than you can move in one GCD, well, do one Ruin 2 and then another Ruin 2, and then get back to your Ruin 3s when you're done moving. If you know the fights well enough, you can probably get to where you need to be fast enough in that 2.5 seconds, give or take however long your GCD is based on your spell speed. Your Ruin 4, that replaces your Ruin 2 when it is procced. How does it get procced? Well, every time your pet does an ability, whether it's an attack, one of its off globals, or even when you rouse or use devotion, which I'll get to later, that has a 15% chance to proc Ruin 4. Now Ruin 4, that's 200 potency, and it's instant, just like the Ruin 2 whose place it's taken. So you want to use Ruin 4 pretty much immediately, and it's a great skill to use for weaving, just like Ruin 2. You don't want to just cast Ruin 3 and then hit an off global and then cast another Ruin 3. Instead, just finish your Ruin 3 cast, hit Ruin 2, weave while your GCD is spinning, you're off global, and then get back to your ruin 3s. If you do a ruin 3 and then an off global and then back to a ruin 3, that's what people call clipping. Don't clip. It wasn't as bad to do in Heaven's Ward because then your ruin 3 was 200 potency, your ruin 2 was 80 potency, so and your ruin 2 used more MP than your ruin 1, which you still had access to. So that kind of made sense to clip back in Heaven's Ward, although I won't get into that actually. But since ruin 3 and ruin 2 are so close in potency, always use ruin 2 to weave in any off global you need. You can also, getting into the your dots down here, your bio 3 is instant, so that's also a good time to use it in off global if you need to. Although if you're doing your rotation right, the off global you're using there is pretty much already set in stone. It's going to be Aetherflow. But for all intents and purposes, use Ruin 2 and Ruin 4 for your weaving and movement. Now, once I go over the dot rotation, you will understand why you only use Miasma 3 and Bio 3 every 2 minutes. This is the biggest mistake I see summoners do everywhere. I look at FF logs all the time, and I'm trying to help people out and figure out the thing that they're doing wrong. And almost every time, the first thing I notice is they're using Miasma 3 and Bio 3 twice as much as they should be. And once I explain the dot rotation, you'll have an epiphany, and that will help your DPS probably the most. And your last GCD is Tribind. This is a do as I say, not as I do ability. Why do I say that? I don't even have this ability hotbarred. Now, any good summoner will tell you you can get a DPS gain by using Tribind and Dreadworm Trance. I mean, you don't want to use it outside of Dreadworm Trance because it's a 30 potency ability. And it is AoE, so it adds up, but it's 70 potency in Dreadworm. Now, I will go over the AoE rotation later, but in most cases, I find that it's easier to just fast Dreadworm, or rather fast Death Flare, and go straight into your next stack of Aetherflow, and then just use Pain Flares. I'm not going to get too detailed into that now, but you can actually do just fine DPS without even using Tribind. But pretend I didn't say that and use it anyway in Dreadworm and AoE circumstances. The first set of off-global abilities I want to go over is Aetherflow abilities. And this is the number one thing that you should learn as a summoner. And that is Aetherflow is something you need to be using on cooldown. It should never, ever just be sitting there waiting for you to hit it. You should have used your 3 stacks by the time it's up again. And that's pretty easy to do considering all these abilities have no more than a 10-second cooldown. So you use Aetherflow, you get 3 Aetherflow stacks. And then depending on the situation, you determine which one of your 4 Aetherflow abilities you want to use. Now if it's a single target, you would obviously want to use Fester, that's 300 potency. If it's 2 targets or more, use Pain Flare. I mean, 2 targets, it's 180 potency times 2, that makes it 360. It's already a gain over Fester. The more targets you have, the bigger gain Pain Flare is. Now, the other AoE ability is Bane, and that spreads your dots from whichever enemy has the dots on it to enemies around it. You don't want to use this if the enemies die quickly. And this is something you kind of have to figure out in a dungeon. For example, look at the other DPS's gear. Do you think they are going to be very helpful in getting through it quickly? If not, I'd say use Bane because you're going to get your full use out of it, and then use Pain Flare. And then there's Energy Drain. You do not want to use this ability unless it is a very specific situation. That specific situation is at the end of a fight, and you want to use your Death Flare or get to Bahamut very quickly, and you're afraid that if you wait for that 5-second cooldown of Fester to come around, that you won't be able to get that Death Flare off, then use Energy Drain. Otherwise, don't use it. That's another ability that I don't even have hotbarred. Moving on, we have Dreadworm Trance, which is available after you've used your 3 stacks of Aether Flow using 3 of the abilities on the previous slide. Doing so gives you a 10% damage buff for anything you do in that window. So your 100 potency Ruin 2s, for example, using Dreadworm Trance, do 110 potency. I used Ruin 2 as an example because 100 potency is an easy number to explain. However, don't use Ruin 2 in Dreadworm Trance. Why? Because number 1, Ruin 3s do more damage, and in Dreadworm Trance, your Ruin 3s become instant casts. So they essentially become buffed Ruin 2s. You can weave in Dreadworm Trance. The one change from Heaven's Ward to Stormblood is you can no longer use stacks in Dreadworm Trance. And that's another misconception about people who have switched or have come back to Summoner after playing it in Heaven's Ward, is they think that Dreadworm Trance is the biggest burst window for Summoner. Well, that was true in Heaven's Ward. That is no longer true in Stormblood, because your Ruin 3s are a lot weaker. You can't use Fester during Dreadworm Trance. And the period after Dreadworm Trance where you use your Festers is actually a bigger burst window, and your Bahamut window, or rotation, is even bigger than your Dreadworm Trance. Now, another benefit of Dreadworm Trance is it resets Tri-Disaster, and that's important to note when I get into the dot rotation later. And one thing that you may or may not know about how buffs work in Final Fantasy XIV is any buffs that are applied to you, as in Dreadworm Trance, as in Balance, as in the Dragon Sight Tether, any dot that you apply with that buff up gets that for the duration that dot is on an enemy, it stays there even when the buff falls off of you. Now, if you refresh that dot when the buff has fallen off, the buff is gone. And this also applies to Shadow Flare. And this is also the case for debuffs that are on the enemy. So things like Trick Attack and Contagion, which I'm going to get to later. If you apply dots when Trick Attack is up, the 10% damage up the Trick Attack does and the 10% damage that Contagion does applies to all the dot ticks that happen for the duration of that dot until you refresh it or until it falls off. Shadow Flare, however, is different in that regard. Debuffs that are on the enemy only buff the damage done by Shadow Flare while the debuff is still on the enemy. That's how all area effect dots work in this game. So that's why it's important to use the next ability, Tri-Disaster, which is a off-global ability that applies Miasma 3, Bio 3, and Ruination instantly. You want to use that during Dreadworm Trance with that buff up, because those two abilities, Miasma 3 and Bio 3, that's 1,000 potency over the next 30 seconds. And this essentially adds 100 to it. It also adds Ruination, and what Ruination does, it puts a debuff on the enemy that any ruin spells that hit it do an extra 20 potency. This also applies to any other party member, like a Scholar using Ruin 2. Their Ruin spells also do an extra 20 potency. Then there's Death Flare. Death Flare is an AoE ability that can only be used while in Dreadworm Trance, and as soon as you use it, it ends Dreadworm Trance. It's 400 potency, but each enemy it hits, as in the first the enemy you target, it does 400 potency damage to that enemy. The next enemy that it hits, it's 360, then 320, 280, all the way down to 200, and everything after that is just 200. Now technically, because you're in Dreadworm Trance with the 10% buff, it's actually 440 potency, so just add 10% to all those other lower numbers. Then you have Rouse. This is a 60-second cooldown. You don't want to try to use Rouse before summoning Bahamut, because it doesn't affect Bahamut's damage. Bahamut Rotation, or Bahamut Burst, is the biggest burst the summoner has, but Rouse does not help it. So don't use it right before summoning Bahamut. You just wasted it. That's why if you've got less than 20 seconds before you're going to summon Bahamut, just wait till Bahamut rotation is done and then use Rouse. The worst that could happen is, depending on the kill time of the fight, you may get one less use of Rouse. That's okay. You can, if you're doing speed kills and stuff like that, you're probably more advanced for this video anyway. I will do an advanced summoner guide another day. But as a rule of thumb, use Rouse on cooldown unless it's right before you're about to use Bahamut. Then in Kindle, another rule of thumb, use it whenever you're in the Rouse window, the Rouse buff. If Enkindle comes off cooldown, just wait till Rouse is up again. The one exception is towards the end of a phase or the end of a fight, and you won't get to use Rouse before the boss is dead. Then just use Enkindle. And your last 4 off globals are Devotion. And this is one that's also changed since the beginning of Stormblood. It used to be a 5% damage up, 5% damage mitigation, and 5% healing to the person closest to the pet. And it is now a party-wide buff that's only 2% damage up, 2% damage mitigation, but yet still 5% healing received to anyone who's close enough to receive the buff when Devotion is used. And this is in relation to the pet, not you. So if you're using Garuda and you want everyone to get Devotion, you'll have to make sure she's in a spot where everyone will actually get Devotion. And then the best part about playing Summoner is summoning Bahamut. You can only do this after you have done 2 Dreadworm Trances, and it doesn't matter if you missed your Death Flare or not, although if you missed Death Flare, you're losing a lot of DPS there, so make sure you don't miss that at the end. And then there's the Enkindle Bahamut, which on a 13-second cooldown, with Bahamut being up for only 20 seconds, that means you only get to use Enkindle or Akmorn twice every time you summon Bahamut. And I will go over the Bahamut rotation later in the video. I talked about Shadow Flare earlier. It's a area AoE, meaning it's anything that's inside it when the server ticks go off gets hit with 50 potency every 3 seconds. I highly recommend using the macro that I've got here on the slide. You can just assign that to your hotbar and you can weave it into your rotation pretty easily. Now we can briefly go over the role abilities. Diversion is something that anyone should be using if you have access to the ability, depending on what job you're playing. You want to use that pre-pull. It reduces the aggro that you are generating while it's up by 90%. That's huge. If you're pulling aggro while using diversion, get a new tank. Lucid Dreaming. This has two uses. One, if you're running low on MP, which is either because people are dying and you're doing a lot of raises, or you died and you need MP, then you use it for that. Or a tank dies, you need to cut aggro so that you can do raises and not die yourself. Lucid Dreaming also cuts your own aggro by 50% of what it was when you used it. It's not like Diversion, where while it's up, it's cutting the aggro you're generating. It just, as soon as you use it, however much aggro you had gets cut in half. And then for prog especially, Swiftcast is a must-have. You use that when you need to raise people during prog. It's something you can also use for your Miasma 3, which is a hard cast. You don't want your dots to fall off, but you might be moving and you can't get that Miasma 3 off, so you just swift cast Miasma 3 and then you move as if it were Ruin 2. APOC, that's something you definitely need in raiding. It helps when you're trying to clear content early and you don't have good gear yet. It makes healer's life easier. It's 20% magic damage mitigation to whoever you're targeting, usually a tank. It's a really powerful ability that most summoners don't use often enough, and they should be. And then there's this hidden gem, Addle, which has a mitigation purpose that you can use in prog, because any magic damage that a enemy is doing gets reduced by 10%, which can be pretty big if it's any hard-hitting ability, and it's especially useful in UCOB on Golden Bahamut. You definitely want to use Addle there. But it has another purpose for summoners, and that is when Bahamut is summoned, it triggers a Worm Wave, which I'll go over in a minute. And other role actions you should be using is Mana Shift. It's very helpful to healers, especially in prog where they're raising people, you're raising people, people need MP. It's also good in speed kills where if you have a bard in the group, which you should have if you're doing a speed kill, if not a machinist, but assuming you have a bard, you can mana shift the bard and extend foe requiem, which drains their MP. And then Surecast. This is a almost mandatory ability to have in certain fights. What it does is make you invulnerable to knockbacks like in Shinryu. If you don't want to get knocked from one end to the other by the tidal wave, just pop Surecast. You can sit still and watch everyone slide across the screen. Same with 12S, the door fight, the Omega female. She does her thing that knocks you back. You can Surecast, you won't move, you can sit there and keep casting. It's a great thing to use to keep your DPS up without having to run halfway across the screen. And finally, there's a race, which you can use for tank busters. You don't want to use it if the tank is using home gang or something like that. They're going to go down to 1 HP anyway. The healer's probably going to pop an Addiction or Essential Dignity, whether you got an ASD or a White Mage. It's something you can throw out if your healer or tank says they need help with something during a fight, especially in prog. A race is nice to use. Not mandatory, but it's still nice to use. Now there are two other role actions, Break and Drain. I'm not going to go over those. I don't use them. If you like using them, if they help you out, more power to you. I don't hotbar them. I don't use them. They're worthless to me. And finally, we have our notable pet abilities. If you're using Garuda, which you should be, the number one reason you're using Garuda is because of Contagion. Contagion is a 10% damage debuff to the target for 15 seconds. It's just like Trick Attack that a ninja uses, except it only applies to magic damage, where Trick Attack is a 10% damage to all damage, but this is 15 seconds instead of 10. So for you, Contagion is better than Trick Attack, which is a pretty big deal. And it's actually a big DPS increase for healers. It's a gain for paladins to use their Holy Spirits. This is where you want to fit all of your bursts into. It's the only reason you use Garuda. But while Radiant Shield was nerfed, it's still a good thing to use pre-pull to help out the other DPS in the group and your tanks. It's only a 2% damage debuff, but why not use it? If you're doing a pre-pull, you're not losing anything. You're only helping out your raid group. It's the way it works is really strange. It puts a buff on you, and it doesn't actually put the physical damage debuff on any enemies until someone with the Radiant Shield buff gets hit, and then it applies to whatever hit them for 4 seconds. And since the debuff is on you for 20 seconds, assuming you're getting hit within 4 seconds, you're going to refresh that 4 seconds each time you're hit. So it can actually be up for a total of 24 seconds if everything works out right. But if you're doing a pre-pull, you're not going to get a full 20 seconds out of it. It's more like going to be 12. That being said, it's really nice for trash pulls because unlike Contagion, which just hits one target, Radiant Shield, if it's on the tank and he's getting hit by a bunch of enemies, that 2% damage buff is going to go on all of them. And the next thing is Worm Wave. Now, when this expansion started, this is something that most summoners were getting wrong left and right. And it's more or less cleaned up, but there are still people that still get it wrong. Yes, every time you cast Ruin 3 or Ruin 2 or Ruin 4, when Bahamut's out, Bahamut does a Worm Wave. But also, when you use any Aetherflow abilities on a target, Bahamut also does a Worm Wave. And Addle actually triggers a Worm Wave. You can get 11, and in some cases people have gotten 12 Worm Waves in each Bahamut summon. That's what you want to shoot for. That's the rotation I'm going to give you. If you're not using your Aetherflow abilities when Bahamut is out, you're losing 480 potency. That is more than a Death Flare. The last two abilities I want to go over are Mountain Buster and Flaming Crush. There are two abilities that don't require a target. You can use them, Mountain Buster with Titan and Flaming Crush with Ifrit, away from the boss pre-pull. And it gives you that 15% chance to get that Ruin 4 proc. Why not do it? It doesn't hurt you. Speaking of pre-pull, let's get to the pre-pull opener. So, this is what I do. And you can find many other openers, and there are going to be plenty of other orange parsing summoners out there that will tell you why mine's wrong and theirs is better, and I can argue what I don't like about theirs, so on and so forth. I'm just going to give you mine. If it doesn't work good for you, use another one. Go to the Balanced Discord. They have plenty of good ones out there. This is what I use. Try it out. If it works for you, great. So what I do is as soon as we get into the instance or we've wiped, I summon Titan. And then I wait for the tank or whoever to do the countdown. When there's 15 seconds left, I do Mountain Buster. I try to get that Ruin 4 proc. Why not? I'm going to do my Ruin 3 precast and then a Ruin 2. If that's a Ruin 4, that's 100% potency gain. So that fishing for the Ruin 4 proc, it's only 15% chance, but get an extra 100 potency. That's a pretty big deal. And then whether I get that proc or not, I summon Ifrit. I wait for the countdown to get to about 8 seconds, maybe 9. It depends on your connection and your spell speed and all that. With Ifrit out, you start summoning Garuda. The way pet actions work is, with the exception of Devotion and Enkindle, you can actually have your pet do any other ability while you're casting something. So if you want to use Contagion and you're using Obey, while you're in the middle of a Ruin 3 cast, you can hit Contagion and Garuda will use it. You don't have to weave pet abilities, you don't have to do it while you're not casting. So what I do is I start summoning Garuda, and in the middle of that cast, I hit Radiant Shield. That way I get an extra second or two of Radiant Shield on everyone, and maybe get an extra proc on the boss and for another 4 seconds. And then at that point you've got about 5 seconds left. So then you use Diversion and then your potion, and then those take about a second each. If you're me, the pot takes 3 seconds and you have to do everything 3 seconds earlier because the damn thing won't go off. But do what you have to do. Depends on your latency. Adjust that as necessary so that you've got 3 seconds left to cast your Ruin 3 pre-pull. And if you've paid any attention to Garuda's cast bar, you'll see that she's pretty slow at doing that first Windblade. So I actually hit Sick 2 seconds pre-pull so that she casts Windblade about the same time your Ruin 3 actually hits. So now the actual opener. It's just a Ruin 2 Weave Fest. That's all it is. You're hitting Ruin 2, doing 2 off globals, hitting Ruin 2, doing 2 off globals. And if you get any Ruin 4 procs, it replaces Ruin 2 automatically, which is awesome because you won't miss any. So you won't ever be sitting on Ruin 4 like, oh, I could have hit that here. No, it's automatically replacing Ruin 2. So just pretend the Ruin 2 is a Ruin 4 and you're good to go. Now, as a controller player, I actually put all my off globals in order and just hit Ruin 2, hit 2 buttons, hit Ruin 2, hit the next 2 buttons, hit Ruin 2, hit the next 2 buttons, over and over again until I get to the end of my opener, and then I switch to my hotbar that I actually use for the rest of the fight. It actually works out really well for Summoner, and if you can do that, I recommend doing that. So let's go over what's happening here. I'm casting my precast Ruin 3, which is on the previous slide. So once that Ruin 3 hits, I do my Ruin 2, I try Disaster, which gets the dots and Ruination up. Then I do Devotion, do my next Ruin 2, I burn 2 stacks, Fester and Pain Flare. I do another Ruin 2, then I weave in my Shadow Flare, which is a macro, and my Mana Shift, which is also a macro. This Mana Shift is to the Bard to extend Foe Requiem. Don't do this if it's prog. Save your Mana Shift for your healers in case they need to do raises or you need to do raises. Then I do my Ruin 2, Rouse, burn my 3rd stack. I can now go into Dreadworm trance. So I use Ruin 2, Dreadworm, try Disaster while I'm in Dreadworm. Since I'm in Dreadworm, Ruin 3s are instant, so I hit Ruin 3. I can weave off of that Ruin 3, so I do a Death Flare. Now if you have a Ruin 4 proc, use your Ruin 4 proc. Don't use Ruin 3 if you have a Ruin 4 proc. So then I do my Death Flare, Aether Flow, and now I've got 3 more stacks. So then I'm doing my Ruin 2, my Rouse is still up, so I'm going to hit my Fester and then my Enkindle, which is roused. I'm going to hardcast a Ruin 3, do a Ruin 2, and then a Fester, and then another Ruin 3, and you'll see I stop there and I don't spend my 3rd stack. Why am I not spending my 3rd stack yet? I will explain that. But to explain that, I first need to go over the dot rotation. So how do I get away with only hardcasting Miasma 3 and Bio 3 every 2 minutes? Well, it actually happens the first time at around 1 minute and 15 seconds in, and then it doesn't happen again until 2 minutes after that. So why am I doing it 1 minute and 15 seconds in? Well, as I showed in my opener, you do your Dreadworm Trance, you do your Death Flare, then you do your Aether Flow, and then I use my 2 stacks, and then I'll get at some point I'll use my 3rd stack, and I'll explain why I don't use that right away necessarily. And then I go into Dreadworm Trance, and Dreadworm Trance resets Try Disaster. So I'm going to use that Try Disaster, which has now been reset, and I don't have to wait 60 seconds to use it again, at the end of the first Try Disaster's use. So when the dots from the first Try Disaster I use in my opener have 1 second left, I am going to use Try Disaster again in Dreadworm to extend for 30 seconds longer. And then after that, I will use my hardcasted Miasma 3 when there's about 3 seconds left of the dots, because this is a hard cast, so by the time the cast is over, it's going to hit when the dot is falling off. And then Bio 3, which is instant cast, so it'll apply about 1 second later, so they're both being refreshed at almost the same time, right when the dots fall off. And then I'll use Aether Flow and 3 stacks during the Bahamut phase for my extra worm waves. But I'm not going to go into Dreadworm even though I have my 3 stacks, because Try Disaster is going to naturally come off cooldown because I haven't used it for 60 seconds. I used it during Dreadworm before hard casting it, which didn't get refreshed for 30 seconds, which is when my hard cast went off after 30 seconds, and then that stayed on for another 30 seconds, so after 60 seconds, my Try Disaster is naturally off cooldown, and I use that to refresh my dots. Now, since I've also burned 3 stacks during Bahamut, when I have 15 seconds or 16 seconds left before Aether Flow comes off cooldown, I'm going to go into Dreadworm again, which will reset Try Disaster, which puts me right back at my opener. And so then I'll use my Death Flare, I'll use Aether Flow to get my 3 stacks, I'll burn the 3 stacks, I'll reset Try Disaster again, I'll use Try Disaster, then it's been 2 minutes since I last hardcasted, and then I'll hardcast my dots again. Once you've figured that out, you've saved yourself a lot of headache. You will only have to use Miasma 3 and Bio 3 once every 2 minutes. And for the Bahamut rotation, there are a number of different ways to do this, and you may have to adjust based on your ping, or if you're trying to go for the 12 worm wave dream, which good luck. Chances are, even if you're seeing 12 worm waves, it ghosted. And what that means is it might actually show up in your parse is hitting it, but it didn't actually hit the enemy. So go for 11 worm waves, and if you've used the opener I've used, you use Try Disaster, then Death Flare, then Aether Flow, which means by the time you're hard casting your dots again, your Aether Flow will be off cooldown at around the same time. So you'll be double waving off of your Bio 3 in your refresh, and this saves you from having to lose 20 potency by doing a Ruin 2 to weave in your Aether Flow. You just weave in off your Bio 3, you use Aether Flow, you summon Bahamut. Then this is I'm just going to explain why this is the way it is, and if you need to adjust it, there are different Bahamut rotations on the Balance Discord, but this is why I do it this way, and this is why it works. So you use Ruin 2 and then your Fester, and even though Bahamut may not even show up on your screen yet, after hitting Summon and using Ruin 2 and Fester, it's still going to register both of those as worm waves that need to go off. So Don't worry about waiting until you've seen Bahamut to start worrying about worm waves. Do your Ruin 2, do your Fester, do your Enkindle, just like that. And then I do 2 Ruin 2s before I weave something else in, because that Akmorn usually takes a moment to actually happen. And if I do a Ruin 2 and then a Fester immediately without doing a second Ruin 2, I'm probably going to miss a worm wave waiting for that Akmorn to go off, because it's kind of in a queue to go off. So I need to wait for that Akmorn to happen. So I let Bahamut catch up more or less by doing that 2.5 second GCD for him to get off that second and third worm wave. And then once I do my next Ruin 2, then I do a Fester for an extra worm wave. Then I do another Ruin 2. Then I do an Addle, which gives me a worm wave. Then I do a Ruin 2 for another worm wave, another Fester for another worm wave, then a Ruin 2, then an Enkindle again, and then a Ruin 2. If you count that up, that's 7 Ruin 2s for 7 worm waves. That's 3 Festers for 3 more, and an Addle for your 11th. And that's how you get 11 worm waves. You need to find what works for you, adjust that as necessary. You can look in your battle log to make sure you're getting 11. That's the number you need to go for. That's how you get the most potency out of your Bahamut window. So going back to the opener, you'll see again that I only have 2 Festers used after my Death Flare, and then I've got a hardcasted Ruin 3. And then what happens next? Well, what happens next depends on whether or not you're getting Ruin 4 procs. Now I do the second Fester in a Ruin 2 weave, and the first Fester actually in a Ruin 2 weave as well, because if all goes well, Contagion is just falling off right as that second Fester hits. If you're getting that second Fester and the Contagion window, all is well. Sometimes, and you'll see when I show an example of openers in a moment, that Contagion falls off before that second one hits, and you have to adjust when you're using Sick with Garuda pre-pull. That can set Contagion back a little bit, or you can do a Obey opener and have Garuda use it on your 3rd or 4th GCD, depending on how the fight works out for you, how Garuda is drifting Contagion, but that's for my advanced video, so I won't address that in here. But I want to address when you use that 3rd Fester. So if I get a Ruin 4 proc right as I'm casting that last Ruin 3 that's here on the diagram, I'm going to use Ruin 4, and I'm going to use that 3rd Fester, and I'm going to just wait until I either get another Ruin 4 proc, because if I get another Ruin 4 proc, I'm just going to go straight into Dreadworm, because I've used my 3rd Fester, and I'm going to wait till my dots fall off in Dreadworm and use Tri-Disaster. Why am I waiting for Ruin 4 procs? Because I'm trying to use the fewest number of Ruin 2s as possible. Since Ruin 3 is 20 potency higher, I don't want to cast Ruin 2 if I don't have to. But I'm casting the Ruin 2s here for these first 2 Festers, because even though it's a 20 potency loss to use Ruin 2 instead of Ruin 3, I'm getting that Fester off in Contagion, which is a 30 potency gain. So I'm losing 20 potency by using those Ruin 2s, but I'm actually gaining 10 overall because I'm getting those Festers off in Contagion. And it's even more than that for the first Fester, because Trick Attack, if you have a Ninja, should still be up for that, as well as it should be up for your Enkindle, which is Roused. If any of those Ruin 2s get procced into a Ruin 4, then it's not a loss at all, and you're getting some pretty good DPS gains there. So you always want to hope for as many Ruin 4 procs as possible. Now I'm going to go and show you 2 examples of what I do in my opener after I've done that second fester to show you kind of what I do if I do get a Ruin 4 proc right away, and then what I do if I don't get a Ruin 4 proc right away. And what I do if I don't get one right away is if my dots have less than 15 seconds left, I'm actually going to double weave from that Ruin 4 proc, do a fester, and go straight into Dreadworm. And I'm going to go straight into Dreadworm. That way I can weave and move around as much as I want, and I'm not going to be using any Ruin 2s to get into Dreadworm later. I can risk it and hope I get another Ruin 4 proc to weave into Dreadworm. But since I'm using my Ruin 4 proc to do my third fester, I might as well go into Dreadworm as well, as long as there's less time on the dots than the duration of Dreadworm. Because if I go into Dreadworm too early, then my dots, then I'll be clipping the dots, and you definitely don't want to do that, because then your dots will fall out of trick attack window, assuming you have a ninja. So let me go ahead and show two examples. The first one where I do get a Ruin 4 proc, and the second one where I don't for a couple GCDs. You may have noticed in both of those openers, Contagion actually did fall off right before that second fester went off, so screwed those up for you. I let you down. I'm sorry. But I'm going to finish this video with a full rotation. I'm going to go from opener all the way to a second Bahamut rotation. And I'm going to do that just so you can see the full 2-minute rotation from Bahamut to Bahamut, and give you an idea of what that looks like. I hope this video was helpful to you. I would appreciate any feedback you can in the comments, and hopefully someday soon I can get to work on the more advanced guide. Thank you.